Hello everyone and welcome to the next episode of You Don't Serverless. This time is the last episode of prototyping it before we go to best practices. And who better to be here than Jeremy Daly. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And before we even begin, we're going to do some testing as well of the loyalty service. We also have some TypeScript, lots of tooling, lots of stuff. We've been discussing that, Jeremy and I, before we started this stream. And it seems like there's a lot of tooling, there's a lot of stuff you should know besides just writing the task itself. And we should be capturing that piece. So I just want to ask you, Jeremy, is there anything you want to tell us about? You've done so many about the newsletter or podcast and things like this. So anything you want to bring us today?
Yes, so I'm doing some merchandising. So Serverless Chats is my new podcast. It comes out June 17th. We are going to be talking about all things serverless. I got some great guests lined up, and it should be really interesting. It's sort of beyond the what is serverless and goes a little bit deeper into some of the technical details. So that is hopefully going to be exciting for some, and for others it may put them to sleep, but I enjoy it, so I'm doing that. And then also my Off by None newsletter, offbynone.io, weekly serverless newsletter that is about, 2,000 pages long every week, it seems like, because there's so much awesome serverless content out there. I just read it all. I grab all the interesting stuff, put some comments in there, and send it out every week. Use cases, stories, just good reads, events coming up, things like that. So subscribe to that. I'd appreciate that. And and again, I'm all over the place, Twitter and stuff like that. So if you want to reach me, at Jeremy_Daly, and I'd love to chat with you and talk serverless.
Awesome. Okay, so let's kick this off then. So Jeremy, I would ask you to switch your video off, and then I'm just gonna go over where we're supposed to be, and let's go through this. So let me know if you're seeing my screen. You should be. There should be a bunch of coding there.
Oops, I see your screen.
It's switching it now. It should go. So it might take about 5 or 10 seconds, so let me know. You should see an event.json. Awesome. So for those of you folks who are seeing this for the first time, we are disabling the video just because I'm having some hardware issues which I need to fix. But we're here with you. We're going to go through for the next hour. The last episode, we were doing what we call loyalty service, which basically is a file inside a repository, a folder actually, that you would see source, backend, and then each of those services. And loyalty is the one that we're still writing it. There's going to be a pull request after this episode, and that we should be able to see how we are refactoring and how we are improving before we hit the merge to the CI system. What we're going to be doing is there's one particular piece that we tested yesterday, which was the ingest. And basically this ingest add the points to a customer, a loyalty member. And we're going to be testing that function and also walking through how that's possible. There's a bunch of tooling that we're using that may not be easy for the first time. At least it wasn't for me. So I'm interested in showing that over to you. And then we go through the testing. And Jeremy, as always, surely has lots of advices for us and how we could do better. So let me show you what we're doing visually. So last episode, we showed you how we implemented the booking system and introduced step functions and all that stuff. And now what we're actually coding as we speak is the whole page on the top right here, which is my name, my loyalty status, my reference number, and also how many points I got, and obviously how far am I to the next tier. This is not yet integrated into the front end. We're building the schema and everything. So if you want to follow that, you should actually go through the main repo, which is AWS Simples, AWS Serverless Airline Booking. And if you go to the pull request, we're going to be opening one tomorrow. If you are curious about how we solved some of the other problems, some of the hiccups we had, each of those has links to developer tools or design choices that we have to make, even before README gets completed. So watch out for this. So how do we start? Last night we had a challenge with SNS not being able to publish a message to Lambda. So if you're watching from yesterday, I'm just going to recap that real quick. This SNS topic is what we publish the message once we have a reserved booking. And once that's reserved, we call a Lambda function called ingest, which is the one we're going to test right now. Unfortunately, for some reason, we couldn't figure out at the stream yesterday why you could test it through the console, but not through SNS. So it turns out it was an issue with the runtime 10, Node.js 10. We switched to Node.js 8.10. It's actually now working just fine. We couldn't quite figure out yet why that's the case, but if we figure that out, you're going to be able to see that into the pull request. So just to show you how it's supposed to work, and then we go to test, so it makes sense and why we're testing. So I'm going to copy an event which actually is going to come from a step machine. So if I just say this, I'm going to zoom in case you're not seeing it. This should have a customer ID and the price of the flight. So we're basically calculating points based on the price. So let's just say human, because why not? And then we publish that message. And if that works, we should go to DynamoDB. And in DynamoDB, there's a loyalty table, which is actually this one here. And here we go. We should be able to see a new entry with a new UID, the customer name, the date, and how many points. So the reason you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is we're not doing anything fancy on the point system. We're just getting the price of the flight and adding that as the points. We will evolve this. Don't worry. There's plenty of complexity already. So that's pretty much it from the loyalty system and the whole logic of it. Do you have any questions, Jeremy, before we kick off the testing? Just in case that wasn't well explained. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So let's walk through that code. So let me know if it's readable. I'm trying to zoom in as much as I can. So you should be able to see my Visual Studio Code into one part of the Lambda function, which is the handler. It's written in TypeScript. Can you see that? Perfect. So the way we start is we do a few imports, which I'm going to show in a minute. And by the way, thanks to Simon Tolborn who wrote the function. So I'm just being the one speaking about it, which is easy. So he wrote most of that. And we get the event from SNS, and TypeScript just does a basic validation of an interface, if that really is an SNS. So if you were to try to do something like, let's say, like this, and pass something else, that would fail already in saying this is not the SNS event. So it's a basic type checking. It's not strictly checking for real, because this gets you a build into JavaScript, but it does a job for what we need. And that event itself, because it's an SNS, we walk through the whole array of events, and then we say this particular SNS is the record we are interested in. From here, we can obviously start asking who's the customer, what's the price, and we can start adding the points, which basically does the manipulation of writing to DynamoDB, doing a try and catch, etc. Actually, that's a good point. I actually may even just do an autocomplete to document this, which is a quite interesting Lambda function handler that takes one SNS message at a time. And then we just explain everything else. Yeah. Perfect. And what this does, the real piece about the code is inside that function called add points. We don't want to clutter the handler and add everything we need in there. As Jeremy and I were discussing, and Jeremy can correct me if I'm wrong, the handler should only be doing a small piece, as little as possible. And the whole logic should actually be in the function itself, which you can treat as a normal function. You can even go use something else if you feel to. Okay, so let me just do this. So it sounds like it's not patching as yesterday. So I'm just gonna put it into speaker and let me know if they can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
They should.
Okay, I hope so. All right, well, so what I was, we are not able to hear Jeremy. Oh no, yeah, yes.
So they are now.
Okay, great. All right, never mind. Problem solved, everyone. Crisis averted. So then let me repeat what I said earlier about the record, about the SNS message that is coming in. So you'll notice that you're calling records 0, you're grabbing the first element in an array. That's the standard format that AWS uses on a lot of its incoming events, where it puts records into an array. Because if you're batching and you have SQS coming in, or you have Kinesis coming in, or DynamoDB streams, you would have multiple records that would come in with every event, or you could have multiple records. So the idea of using record 0, though, in it with this SNS is because SNS will only ever send you one message at a time. So it's safe to just check the first record. You don't have to loop through and see if there's other records in that event that comes in.
Exactly. And you also mentioned something interesting to me offline, which I didn't think it through. In here, we absolutely trust that TypeScript will do its thing, and we'll always make sure that the interface is there. But Lambda doesn't support TypeScript natively, which means we will have to transpile this and build into JavaScript, which means there's no real type safety there. And you said that you would have a library, a parser or something. Is that what you said?
No, so for this, because again, TypeScript is great because it does do the type checking mostly when you're doing developing. But here, you're not actually handing anything off. What's happening? The SNS event is just a standard format that you can use, so that when you parse that event later on in your handler, there, that the TypeScript will pick that information up. But in actuality, once you publish that code, TypeScript won't help with that and won't actually do any real validation on that. So my comment to you was, you're doing a JSON parse on event.record0.sns.message. It's possible that an event gets sent into this that either doesn't have the records, that somebody else calls this some other way. So if you are going to do something like a JSON parse, it's a good idea to wrap that within a try-catch block as well, and make sure that entire thing completes. And really what you could do here is you could just include those first 3 consts. You could put those within the try you've got already defined.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So you wouldn't need to do 2 try blocks. You could just do the 1.
So something like this. Is that what you're saying?
Actually, I would delete the second the catch under the const points, and go all the way down and delete that next try, so that the 3 consts and the await are all in one try block.
Got you. Okay.
Because you're not using those outside of that.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so something like this one here. So I would move into a single try catch, and if that fails, I will know exactly, and that would fail even before last try catch as well. Okay.
Correct. Yeah, and so and you might want to do better error handling in there. You might want to throw maybe a better message or trigger some other error process. But I think that's good for now. The other thing that I just want to point out too, which is this is good practice, and I think you said when you had gotten this code that you had most of the code was actually in the handler function itself. What we want to do when we're writing these functions is we want to make sure that the handler itself is as lightweight as possible. And it's more about making sure that we can interface correctly with our other methods or subroutines, so that we can actually reuse different things. So if you thought about that add points, which we'll look at in a second, the point of that is to be very generic. We want to be able to test it outside of its context within a handler function, and outside its context within a Lambda at all, right? We want to be able to run unit tests on it. But we also may want to call that in a different way, right? So you may have a lot of these events that come in via SNS, but if you ever wanted to build another interface into the add points function here, you could just add another handler that accepted a different type of event. So maybe it's a manual event that you pass in, and that manual event just contains the customer ID and the points. You could write a second handler that does that, parses it, the correct way, and then sends that into the add points function that you've written there. And then that way you could have it multiple ways. So the idea here is not only code reuse, but you don't want to couple your business logic too tightly to the individual handler functions.
So what you're saying is something like this, where let's say I wanted to have that as API gateway, for instance. I don't have that type, but just kind of a pretending that we have. And you would return a promise the normal way you should, but the difference here is that now you would have, let's say the record would actually be something like this, because we know it's different.
Yeah, and you might JSON, and actually you wouldn't need I don't think you'd have to parse that because it would automatically be parsed as JSON when it comes in as an event. But you could just take that event body and you could do some testing on it, make sure that it contained your record, your customer ID and your price, and then you can go ahead and fire off that add points function there. So yeah, so it's just a way to kind of keep these things decoupled. And I mean, if you think about it too, you could write these functions like the add points. You could write that as sort of a separate module if you wanted to as well, and so that you could use it in multiple places. But it's sort of best practice to make sure that we include, that we don't overload our handlers with too much business logic. That's sort of a bad practice to do that. So keeping them separated is always good. And if this add points is specific to this function, like you're not going to need it somewhere else, then putting it within that function is perfectly fine. Got you.
Okay. So let's go. So let me just remove all this. But that's really interesting. I actually don't remember thinking about that. I haven't yet seen a function that will take multiple event sources, but I can totally see the value of actually that happening. That's really interesting. Okay. So let's save as it is. Let's go through the add points and tell you what exactly that is. So we have a bunch of interfaces and imports in here. We are using DynamoDB document client to write that into DynamoDB. We're also using UUID for obvious reasons. And we are using the AWS Lambda types that we just discussed. We can see the context and SNS event. The interface just kind of helps us to, keeps us sane from that. That's the value of TypeScript in that scenario. So the loyalty points gets that particular, which you saw in the DynamoDB, the customer ID, the points, the flags, whether they're active or not. And the add points itself is kind of documented right here, but we're doing something different than the usual as well. We're not only writing to Dynamo, but we're also doing some dependency injection in here. So we're actually passing the customer ID as a parameter, and we're getting how many points we should be adding that. And we're also getting the DynamoDB already initialized. Would you mind explaining what we should be doing? Why do you think is a best practice to do that, Jeremy?
Yeah, so dependency injection is a really good habit to get into, especially if you're trying to do any type of mocking, which we're going to do, or even integration test, ways that you can sort of control the interface that you're passing into these downstream functions. So if you took that add points function and you were to import or you were to create a new document client within that add points function, the problem is that if we wanted to mock that in any way, or we wanted to somehow overwrite or monkey patch what that does for us to be able to execute some local testing, it wouldn't let you do that. Yeah, so if you did Dynamo there and you did a new document client, so if people are familiar with the way that that monkey patching or stubbing or mocking or whatever you want to call it works, you usually import a module and then you would overwrite a particular method, or you'd instrument a method so that you could capture the input and then manipulate the output of that, so that you could do that in an offline local testing scenario. And also, it's great too, because if you want to throw an error and test how you process an error, it works really, really well to do a mock, because you don't necessarily want to inject some error, and you might not be able to generate all the errors that you can get by testing a live resource. So when you want to overwrite or instrument a particular method, you can't do that until you've created in this case, the document client, until you've created that instance. So if you did it this way, if we tried to call the add points function through a unit test, and we said, okay, well, we're going to patch DynamoDB, we're going to patch the AWS SDK, that actually wouldn't work, because what we're doing is we're creating a new document client within this. So instead, what we want to do is be able to manipulate that document client before we call the add points function. And then that way, which would be dependency injection, that way we have much more control over what that does. And to some degree too, and not that I would necessarily suggest this, but it is possible that if you said, look, I'm writing some function that does, I call it, or scroll down, you've got something in here that is like your put command, right? Mm-hmm. That puts the value or puts the content into the DynamoDB table. So that document.put, for example, if you really, really wanted to, you're using just the native API that's built into the document client, which is perfectly fine. Right. But if you ever did want to write a wrapper on top of that and create your own put command for your document or data, data component or whatever, what's really cool is if you did write a wrapper on top of that, you could always change it, right? So if you said, look, I'm using DynamoDB now, but maybe I need to switch to Serverless Aurora or something like that, then by injecting these dependencies and potentially either writing or mimicking the standard API that comes with the AWS SDK for some of these services, you could actually change the behavior or what the backing source was for the resource. You could change that by just injecting a different dependency that had the same the same API methods attached to it. Mm-hmm. So that's more of an advanced use case, not necessarily probably you wouldn't need it for something like this, but again, it's always an option. If you ever we're writing a sort of a data layer on top of Mongo or DynamoDB or SQL, and maybe you wanted to put some MySQL with a Redis cache in front of it or something like that. Dependency injection gives you that flexibility without having to go in and actually modify the underlying code of the function.
Yeah, and actually that reminds me of Alec. Alec, maybe I can do this. Let's say it was on GitHub Stripe. Here we go. So if you're interested on that pattern that Jeremy is just mentioning right now, take a look at this. Alec and Slobodan actually do a great job on what we call hexagonal architectures and how you can do ports and adapters and that sort of thing. Yes. Even if the whole source in here is actually really educational, at least to my purpose. The way they do the processor, the repository, and the way they do testing is much, much easier than the way I'm actually doing it. At first, it looks very complicated, but in the long run, it definitely pays off. All right, so let's go back to this. So what we're actually doing is nothing fancy for now. What we're just checking is we get the table name from an environment variables because we're using SAM, and the environment variables on Lambda, obviously. The table isn't there, we just throw an error, and then we just create a new item with the scheme the way you actually expect to be in the DynamoDB table. So we get the customer ID that you saw it before, we get the points, which again could be another function, just say calculate points, and then we just pass the points in, they'll return a number, and we're just adding the dates in there. And the params we're just actually separating to look quite nicely in here. We're just saying table name where the table is, and the item as object, and we just do put and dot promise. We're using async await, which honestly, it's awesome, but it was the first time I had to test something like this with await and dot promise. And I'm gonna show you the test now, but it wasn't it wasn't easy. Let's put it this way. So let's go and check the testing now. So the test is.
And so, Hayden, just one second. So there's a little conversation going on in the chat about TypeScript versus JavaScript. So my 2 cents is I love vanilla JavaScript, right? So anytime I can write something and I don't need to import a library, and I can use, I love using, like, for functional programming, I love using Ramda, which is a really great functional programming library for JavaScript. I do love using some of those, but if I can get away with just using map or filter, or reduce, and I can just use, standard JavaScript, native JavaScript. I try to do that. I think ES6 introduced a whole bunch of really great things, with the spread operator and deconstructing variables. I mean, there's a lot you can do without something like TypeScript. So I think the people who like TypeScript, and I like TypeScript, I don't do a lot in it. And the reason is because I think it actually adds a different or an additional layer of complexity to the testing process. But I certainly understand people who love it. And it gives you that security of knowing that all of your types are correct, that all of your items or all of your objects that you create match a particular format and so forth. So I think it is really it's really a personal preference. But if somebody's like, oh, you have to use TypeScript, or, oh, TypeScript's terrible, I don't buy into any of those sort of things. I think it's what your personal preference is. TypeScript is incredibly powerful if you're into it. But you know what? Most of the time, I just do vanilla JavaScript, and it's my favorite. And there is no chocolate flavor available.
No, I kind of agree. When you actually go to the TypeScript, the way you configure TypeScript to work, you have to have this tsconfig in place, which basically you even specify what is the target JavaScript version you want to target on, which you kind of get some of those interesting features, and you also get some like nice benefits of the types. But that also goes to say, when I was doing the front end, so if you look at the front end, there's a lot of JavaScript in here, from view itself, or from actually the store itself, because this became a huge application. If I just look at the real JavaScript without any of, this is just vanilla JavaScript, but using the more modern syntax, I must say it's actually a breeze to work compared to the JavaScript I used to do in the past. I'm no JavaScript expert, but you can use all of those destructuring, and even there's a class now which I know a lot of people are not much of a fan.
I like classes. I like the way they work. I like the syntactical sugar that you can use in order to create functions and things like that. But I also really like fat arrow functions, and I love JavaScript. It's such a flexible language, and part of the thing for TypeScript for me is I feel like it boxes me in. Only because I don't know TypeScript well enough. But with just vanilla JavaScript and ES6 and what you can do, it's I find it to be, good code is good code. So write good code, and you're probably not going to have to worry about some of the other typing issues and things like that. Yeah,
one little trick that I used that I only learned in Visual Studio Code. I know we're kind of splitting off a little bit. We should be back to testing, but I think it's important. No, I think it's important to cover some of that. Is I'm using JSDoc as a way for me to get some of the typings, and that actually it's super clever. And you can even see what's optional in that constructor and things like this. The reason this works beyond just the JavaScript doc is at the root of the repo, which you're gonna see there is I think it's JSconfig. Yeah, over here. So if you have this file in your repo, that will give you exactly what we want, which basically is actually using the TypeScript engine behind the scenes, and it's actually giving you the types that you actually want. The only pieces you don't get that you get with TypeScript, again, is more of an interface, which kind of makes some of the pieces handy. But it's about preference. I agree. I like both. I just don't like testing for TypeScript because it was too hard to do it. but now it's
Yes,
fine.
that is a complaint I have as well.
All right, so how did we do this? So we got the TS config. We're using a framework called Jest. If you never used it, you need to have that either at the root of your project, or because we're using different languages inside the same project, I'm actually having this inside the loyalty folder itself. So when I get into this and I run my test doing package.json, that should use this jest.config in here. All we're doing in here is saying discover tasks are under tasks and obviously under the folder source if that happens to be. And I'm using a plugin used called TS Jest, which basically understands TypeScript and it handles everything it has to handle. So you don't have to compile to JavaScript, just so you could test. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. That was actually the hardest piece to do. Until you get to the right config, it was, I'd say it was interesting.
It's always like that. But I think, another thing too is Jest isn't the only test runner for JavaScript, obviously, or for Node. I really like Mocha, but the problem with Mocha, and it's not really a problem, it's just one of the things with Mocha is that when you use Mocha, you also need to include something like Chai to have an assertion library. If you want to do mocks and stubs, I typically use sign-in.js to do those sort of things. What's really cool about Jest is it just kind of does all of it for you. It's all kind of packaged in there. So I do like Jest, and now now that I'm looking at it again, I've kind of revisited it. I had to deal with an old project with Mocha, so I've been more into that. But revisiting Jest, I personally am gonna take a deeper look at starting to use that more in my workflows, because I think especially for serverless with all of these dependency tests and things like that, it's a pretty good library for that.
Yeah. So this is how it looks like. So let's just go through the tasks first, and then we show you the code back and forth. So what we're doing now is we're essentially importing the ingest, which we showed you previously on the left-hand side. And we're also doing something interesting. We're not going to use this anymore because I'm not testing the handler in this episode. But because we got the event.json to do local development and local prototyping, I could use the same event.json as a way to test some attributes in some other pieces and how it behaves, just for the handler. And we're also using Lambda, SNS, and event and context, which we could use if we were to test that function itself. The way, I don't remember Mocha anymore, but I think it's quite similar. You could do just a describe, and with the overall group of testing you have to run. And then for each individual task, you have test or it. They actually, I think one is an alias to one another. So it's just a preference. I'd say it's a preference thing. Don't know.
Yeah. Test is a little more. It depends. It's how you describe it. But again, it's just an alias, like you said.
Yeah, and this is a trick which I only discovered recently as I was trying to do the test. As you try to use multiple functions inside the same group, and you may have to manipulate different environment variables, you may want to reset the cache and reset the environment variables for those stats. So that's something you could do as well. So you can do using this jest.reset modules. And if you copy the initial environment variables, you can just keep re-adding them back to it. And even if you're running production or integration tasks or things like this, and you may want to change those variables, again, you could do this from here. And inside each of those, you could just make this. Except, obviously, you see a to-do. I don't know why that doesn't work, but maybe I will figure it out afterwards.
So one of the things too that's very cool about Jest. So the before each, there's an after each, there's a before all, there's an after all. So there's a number of these different sort of pre handlers or post handlers that you can use. And the nesting works really, really cool when you nest describe blocks. So you can actually have something that maybe sets up the test outside, does it for all tests, and then or before each. But then within a describe, you have things that run before each within that. But it actually will run the before each outside of the describe, then run the before each inside the describe, and then run your test. And then so it's cool how it nests, and you can build off of one another. So you can build pretty complex testing patterns within the service. So it's very cool.
Yeah. So I'm gonna even delete this piece here because we're not gonna use it anymore, at least not in the handler. Should make kind of that stuff clean. The way we should be testing this is that this function has an environment variable called data table name, which you can see from the data points. We actually captured them here. And the only reason I probably need some research is someone on the chat knows Jest more. I'm sure there is. I thought I would be able to manipulate the environment variable from here, and when I would going to execute my function, it would read from here, like I normally would do in Python, for instance. But that doesn't seem to work. So if you know, it's actually here, and my to-do list keeps increasing. I got this new extension, which is super awesome. You just annotate like to do, and it keeps showing exactly where you need to have some to do to finish. Just in case.
Yeah, so I think the reason why your environment variable isn't working there, when you go back to add points for a second, that is, I'm sorry, go back to the ingest.ts. So you're doing a const data table equals so where were you trying to set the data table name in your test?
So I'm actually setting before I even call the add points. It feels to me that it's actually adding, but this as if it was creating a new environment or shell, as if you're in Unix, and it wouldn't propagate that to the function.
All right, yeah, you should be able to set it outside. I don't know if your delete process dot. Node environment is that's just whether it's prod or dev or what's node underscore environment.
Yeah, so that's exactly what it's the build process that shows me whether that's production, testing, or whatever.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Yeah. All right. So that makes sense. Well, anyway, so this is sometimes what we do, right? We have to, find a workaround for it, either that or Google for a couple of hours to try to figure out why that doesn't work. I think, though, just an interesting point here is how you're importing add points. So if you scroll back up to the top of your test file there,
can you see
and
it?
you have import, you're deconstructing add points from that ingest module. And back over on the ingest.ts, you have an export statement. That export is exporting any constants from the application. Mm-hmm. So add points gets sent out and so forth. So my personal the way that I like to do it is I don't like to export things that don't need to be exported. So really, the only thing that needs to be accessible from a Lambda function is just the handler function. So really, that for me is sort of the only thing I like to export. You certainly can export your functions as well, but it's not always necessary. I'm not sure how this works with TypeScript, but I use a module called rewire. So instead of require, rewire, R-E-W-I-R-E.
Yep.
And what that does is you use it, rewire.
Oh,
so,
sorry. Yeah.
R-E-W-I-R, yeah, I can't even talk. Yes, that. So what rewire does is it allows you to, it gives you an API into different modules that you import. So even if you're not exporting a particular function from either a function or a variable from a module, you can actually go in there and grab that using this that and set functionality. So that's really cool because then you can just make sure that you're not exporting extra stuff out of your modules that don't need to be exported, and then you have to be very specific about what it is you're reaching into the module for and testing.
I see what you mean now. Yeah, it's actually what they standard of the monkey patching for Python that I'm more familiar with, which you can do a monk patch and things like this. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I didn't know that.
So either way works. I mean, I don't think you have much of a security issue that you're dealing with there, but I don't think it's really not that big of a deal at all. But I really do like rewire.
Awesome.
Somebody apparently doesn't like Google. I mean, you could use, what are some of the other ones? Can you still use Lycos? Is Lycos still around? Because I used to love Lycos. That was my favorite.
Yeah, I could just use a duck, duck, and go as well. I mean,
Yeah, duck, duck. There you go. That's a or the what's the Bing, right? Yeah, that's the other one.
yeah. I have it here. See, I have an offered workflow for everything. So let's just like let's just kick off on this one.
Just to finish,
Sure.
So a couple things because I think this is important when you're writing tests. So you had all that. I think scroll back up to the top of that file for a second.
Sure.
You had up at the top there the importing the SNS event and importing SNS event and context. So what's great about these unit tests and what we've done by separating our business logic out of our away from our handler in our ingest.ts, we've now made for testing purposes SNS event and all this stuff that's directly related to AWS or AWS services. We've actually made that irrelevant, right? So you don't need that anymore. So we're actually just testing the function that does something. And even though we are going to be using DynamoDB, which is very specific, obviously, to AWS, we are doing dependency injection. So like we said earlier, we can actually manipulate the dependency that we send in there. So we've really decoupled this particular function or this service. We've decoupled it from Lambda and from the AWS environment in a sense.
Yeah, no, that's cool, and I totally agree with that. If you actually see the same for other services, except that we didn't really add a file. If you go to Booking, for instance, you're gonna see each of those services has a particular function to only do one thing, even if there has a particular file. And you're going to see that in here, you see that the cancel booking itself is just a function that does exactly this. And the handler is actually really dumb. It's only doing some basic checking if the event actually has what it's supposed to have. And then it just do a try catch, do the logic. When I'm going to do the unit testing for this later, I'm only going to test a cancel booking. And that's perfect. It just makes tasks much easier as well.
And another thing you can do too, and I think this probably beyond the scope of what we want to get into, but a very cool thing you can do, I know with Jest and with Mocha, using the serverless framework. I'm not sure how exactly you would do it with SAM, but actually running the Lambda function as if it was in that environment. So actually passing in that SNS event and calling the Lambda function locally as part of the test runner, and then testing the output of that. So that's very possible to do as well, which is always a good sort of local integration test in a sense. And because we are doing the, actually, you know what, I don't want to derail us too much, but if that was the case, if you go back to your ingest.ts quickly, so the ingest.ts, if we wanted to execute this handler, and we wanted to execute the handler itself, but be able to make sure that we pass in a mock or a stub for the DynamoDB table. The problem here is the way that you've got this coded. I'm sorry, scroll back up to the top where you bring in the document client.
Yep, right here.
Right. So the way you bring in the document client there, we might be able to monkey patch that, but most likely the better thing to do would be take that new document client and actually put that into its own module and just export that new document client, because then that way we could just call whatever we were calling to initiate that client, we could overwrite that as part of a monkey patching, and or we could reinitialize that or require that in our test, accessing our patch to it. And then what that does, it's kind of cool because JavaScript or Node will only require a module once. So if you require the AWS SDK at the top level, and then you are requiring another file or importing another module underneath that also requires the AWS SDK, the first one that you did of the higher script, that will actually take precedence so that other one won't even get imported. So that's a really good way for you to write tests by basically overwriting inclusions or requires in nested applications or nested scripts. I don't know if that made any sense, but
No, it does. Do you have it? I mean, I'm sure other people would ask, but if you have any example of that, something you've done in the past that may be open source, or if Alec or Slobodan is actually on the chat and can share some of that, that would be awesome. I know we have 2 episodes just for integration testing that will show how you can do some of the local runs. You execute the function locally, but you actually target the real service, so you don't want to have challenges with fake events, but still running a test runner that executes that function against the real services. So we're going to do that. But if you have any code that shows that particular practice, that would be awesome. I know what you're saying, and I've seen that, but I don't have any sample that I could point customers to.
Yeah, I'm thinking that I might do that in my in Lambda API on GitHub. Lambda-API. It's like a web framework for Lambda functions. Check the tests in there, because I do think, I'm just going to check quickly. I do have an S3 dependency that I use in here that is pulled in that method, in that way. And then what it does is it, actually I think I have an S3 service right here. So actually here, I'm going to paste this into the chat if anybody wants to see it. But basically, this script here, this is what I'm talking about. So go into lib. Just go into lib.
Right.
Sorry, I was on a different browser window, and go to S3 service.
Oh, I see what you're doing. Yeah, exactly the same.
Right. Yeah. So you do it that way, and then what happens is, so you require that AWS SDK, and then you export an instantiation of that S3 module there. And then what you can do is, if you then go back to the tests and you look at, so go to tests and go to probably download, try download is probably one. Yeah, click on download.js.
Yep, I just clicked it.
All right, and then, you see S3 requires that service. And then if you scroll down later, just search for S3 in that file.
I'm sure there's going to be
right
an S3.
There. Okay, see, so now what it does is it stubs. This is stubbing this S3 with arguments, so that when you call this download here, this is the result that you're getting back. Right. So when you call S3 my bucket with this particular key, this is what it's going to return. It's going to return that acceptance rate. So that's basically the stubbed object that comes back. But you couldn't do that if you and by the way, this is your same thing that you had the problem with. See how it's returning a function called promise, right?
That's why I was laughing. I was like, it's the same problem.
Yeah, that's the way to get around that, which we can talk about in a minute. But what's really cool about doing it this way is that now with that stub, and I think if you scroll up, you'll probably scroll up a little bit, because that stub will point to S3. So just scroll up. I'm sure we're a little bit delayed. Keep going. It should actually search for stub. It might be the only thing that's stubbed. That's why. That's my wonderful naming conventions. Search for stub.
Here you go. You're using sign-on, right? Or sign-on.
Sign-on, yeah, right there. Okay, so I'm stubbing the S3 get object. But that S3 get object doesn't exist if you just were trying to patch the AWS SDK. So you have to instantiate that first, get the instance of the S3 module, then that has a get object method to it. So that's what you want to stub. And you couldn't do that if the way that you've got the ingest.ts coded right now, because you wouldn't be able to overwrite that module.
Exactly. No, that makes completely sense. Yeah. No, absolutely agree. All right, we have 10 minutes left, so let's just show let's just
So we
show
should
quickly.
actually show the test then, right?
Yeah, let's just show quickly on that particular task. So one of the challenges with AWS SDK when you're trying to stub is, in this case, we're using dependency injection, but we could have used a proper library like sign-on and things like this, or the AWS SDK mock, which I found quite useful as well. Is when you do a DynamoDB document client, and most of the AWS SDKs, or pretty much all of them, I think, on the JavaScript side of things, is if you were not using the dot promise at the end, you would have to use the callback format. Another way, you would do something like this. And
Don't even type it. Don't use callback.
All right, I'm not gonna do it. So instead of actually doing this, this would actually do a promisify, and that would return a promise, and it would solve everything. However, when you are testing, the mistake I've made, and I promise you, I look at this for about an hour and a half, and I couldn't see it. And it was Alec who also helped me with this. In addition, I also made the problem worse. I did an npm run build, which essentially converts that. I'm gonna let it run in the background, but that runs TypeScript and converts into JavaScript. And my Jest was discovering 2 different test files, and as you imagine, I was changing the file, trying to get this dot promise, and it wasn't working at all. The reason was because I had 2 files. So the way you do this is the document we're passing that is actually this client stub, but it has a put, so which is fine. We just create a new object, and that put is a function which takes a parameter, and that has to return another object which has a dot promise, which again is the attribute or the property promise has to be a function, but it also has to return as a promise. So I know this looks like, at first I was kind of a bit not feeling well. I was like, I don't think that's right. That maybe I'm missing something. But now that I've seen this now one after the other, it makes completely sense to me.
So just one thing, most promise libraries, including the native promise library, if it's waiting for a promise, but you return an object or a string, or you return some value, it will just assume that the promise is resolved. So really what you might want to do in this case is, rather than doing promise resolve equals true, I'm assuming the put statement or the put method for DynamoDB would have some sort of metadata that gets spit back. So if you did want to test against that, you could potentially do that. Now that might not make sense in this situation because it's so simple, but certainly if you did want to test the response and say, like, if it was consistent write or consistent read or whatever, and be able to and test different paths based off of what the response was, you could do that. You could do that as well. So you don't have to return the promise, but if you're just going to return, I think in this case you could just return true, and it would probably work.
Interesting. Yeah, I remember I tried not to use a promise here, and I tried something like this, and that didn't work because it had to be a promise, and it was complaining about this when I run the test.
That's TypeScript though. That's the problem, and that's not because it's expecting a promise. I'm assuming that's probably what it is, but yeah, somebody mentioned on the chat too, which is really interesting, is the JS SDK version 3 it is TypeScript based, and it does have native promises built in. So that will be interesting as well.
Cool.
And Alex says that he needs promise because of the await, but I think, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I'm pretty sure that if you just return a value, that the await will assume that the promise was resolved. Because essentially, if it returns a promise that eventually gets resolved, it should work. But
cool. Yeah. So if we,
Alex, he's a JavaScript master, so I will defer to him.
Yeah. So essentially, if we just do npm t or npm run task, that would just show that everything works. And when I was trying, I remember I was actually trying to do. So I tried so many iterations of this, and it wasn't working at all. So I tried just true, and then again, it was saying, hey, this is not a promise. Or yeah, it took a little while to get this working. Ideally, we should do something even more complex. We could just do something like expect, which is what Jest gives us, which is pretty nicely. and then we can just do dot something, like dot to be truthy, or there's so many. If I just look quickly onto the Jest API reference.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good stuff there. I mean, you can have it, to be. I think there's
actually is an X
array, right? There's all kinds of good stuff.
Yeah, and that's something I was really impressed. We could actually do all of these pieces, but there's something I found. We're gonna touch that on the integration testing. I know we're running out of time, but if you are already at this stage, you're doing integration testing, you need a hand, especially if you're doing JavaScript. Hopefully I can find that library again, but there was a library called AWS test you choose. And it was something really interesting for me, at least, though. I'm not sure if it's a Lambda or this. It's basically I could do something like write to Dynamo and expect the item to be XYZ. Let me see if that's the case. So it was something really that looked really similar to, I don't think that's the one, but I found something that was really similar to the Jest, but pretty much anything else on top of AWS services, including Dynamo, S3. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so that's the library. It's actually really, really clever. So if you are at that particular stage, I would definitely suggest having a quick look. But it sounds like it's quite old now, so maybe don't. 3 years JavaScript have changed like forever.
Might be out of date. Well, I think one of the important things too about doing any sort of mocking or stubbing is, and I know again, I love integration testing, and obviously it's a really good idea to test against real cloud resources. But honestly, when you're trying to iterate through and test on a bunch of different failure paths or even success paths, what's really, really good about Jest or using something like Sign-In or whatever is you can actually make a real call, capture what gets back, comes back, and then use that as an event or as a response that you can test against, right? So if you know that an error event when there is some sort of a throttling event that happens for DynamoDB, if that comes back and gives you a specific message, save that so that you have that, and then you can kind of test against it and say, here's what my code does when I get this type of response. And again, both Mocha and Jest have really good features for how many times a particular thing was called. You can even change. So when it's called the first time, it returns XYZ. When it's called the second time, it returns ABC. And also, again, another thing about Jest too, that they kind of took everything and put it together. It also does code coverage. And we'll get out a report of code coverage for you, so you don't have to use something like NYC. In order to do that. Although I really do like NYC, but still, it does a whole bunch of this stuff for you. So it's nice too, because you're just working with one framework as opposed to having to install 4 different things every time, and it just kind of works out of the box. But a lot of really, really cool things you can do with Jest.
Yeah, I even saw that they have Puppeteer example. What we're going to be using with Lobodon, we're going to be doing an episode of end-to-end test and to visual testing and snapshot regression and things like this. But we're going to be using a Cypress. But it really caught my attention on how complete this is. Yeah, you're right. Right. So to finish this off on the debate of TypeScript, JavaScript, etc., when you were about to deploy all of this, what you have to do in Lambda in that case, you could use Webpack or whatever you want to do. But because Sunbuild doesn't do that, because it doesn't understand as a native runtime, so what we've did for deploying is that we actually have to run an npm install, we do a run build, and then we just package it over and deploy it as it is. The reason that it works is because if we go back to the loyalty, just to finish today's topic, you don't want to see any front end for now. If you are, let me know. Happy to show. If you go here, when it changes, you're gonna change that to the separate file, and once you can see there's the ingest.js in here. So when compiled, I think compile isn't the right word for that, but yeah, let's just get on with that. And you can see that it gets all like squeezed in, and it transforms into normal JavaScript that it can read. But it obviously doesn't have interfaces because again, it doesn't. JavaScript doesn't have interfaces But still, everything is in here, and you have the source mapping if you want to do debugging and things like this. And lastly, before I forget, if you want to do if you are like me and you love using the step-through debugging through testing, this is the only one that worked for me. Happy to put that into the PR. But essentially, you can use Jest with a command parameter called running band, and you can use that as a way to do a step-through debugging inside your project. Just mind the program where you're supposed to run. The path has to be exact. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. We're more than on track. Hopefully that was useful, that discussion. There was a lot in here, I know, but tomorrow we're going to be opening a PR for actually getting all this mangled in and improved over time. And because this is the last episode of not the series, but actually the last episode of... Oh, I forgot the page now. Let me see if I can have in here. We have... Oh, I need to get that in a separate... Let me just go back in here. And build on serverless so you can see the page. So this page here, if you haven't seen this before, just to kind of give you, because it's the last episode, I just want to make sure this is actually clear. If you look at the episodes in here, until the episode number 6, we were prototyping it. We were testing different tools. We're using a bunch of different tricks and make files and a bunch of workarounds as our projects got bigger and bigger and bigger. But starting from episode number 8 is where we're going to start talking about best practices and how we can optimize this if we are working in a large team, for instance, multiple different services and things like this. For now, we're taking into the approach that we could very well change all of these backends and services into separate repos, but because we're constrained in that particular AWS samples, we're just using folders in here as if it was a big monorepo. But we're going to be changing all of this into better orchestrating, using integration tasks. And we're also going to have Yan Chewy as well on the last episodes to do all the tracing capabilities, structured logins, custom metrics, dashboards, and all that sort of thing we're going to be doing at the last one. And lastly, which we need your help pretty please, is we will have an episode that's voted by you. So you have to tell us what would you like. If I go to the real repo, there's an issue in here where people are voting and asking for whatever they want. So there's a bonus episode in here. We've got so far things like, I want to do an ETL process. All you need to do is just do a like in like this. And actually, the like, not dislike. And make sure you actually add your votes. Tell us what you would like to see. And essentially, we're going to be doing that as an additional episode in August. There's only one piece here that if we continue to hear more and more is not only the ETL, but there's one comment here that I really loved, which was about what if you could build a mobile app off this project? So that's something we could do as well. So please vote, and I'm going to leave the last words for Jeremy, and in case I missed anything.
I think you got it. Yeah, I think you got it all. Yeah, this was fun. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Any last advice or something for someone who's doing testing, where they can find resources? Are you planning to write any new content on the testing? Are you looking for any suggestions? Because you write a lot.
Yeah, not as much as I would like actually, but I have a couple of blog posts that talk about testing that go through JavaScript testing with Mocha, NYC for code coverage. And a couple of other things like that that you could that would be useful. Probably have to search for it if you maybe over down on the right. I don't know. I don't even know if there's a search box on here. This is still WordPress, by the way, so don't. I don't.
Shame.
I don't have a serverless site yet, and I feel really bad about it. But yeah, no, there's some stuff on there, and you can look around for the testing stuff. And again, if anybody wants to sign up for my newsletter, please feel free to do that. And if you want to get a 25-page document in your email every week with all the great links and stuff happening around the serverless world, then do that.
Awesome. Like I said many times before even the stream, it's a huge pleasure to have you, and so it is also to have many other awesome people helping out, other developer advocates, and also serverless heroes. So thanks, Alec, also for the help earlier. I know you're not live in here, but you are helping tremendously, Simon, and pretty much everyone in the backstage. Like I said on Twitter, it takes a village to produce something like this. There's actually 7 more hours to go through more and more content for you on a weekly basis. Thank you everyone for watching. Thank you, Jeremy, once again. And enjoy everyone and have a great weekend if I don't see you next